This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not offered as legal or professional advice regarding any particular matter. No person should act on the basis of this presentation without seeking appropriate professional advice. The speaker's views expressed in this program may not be reflective of those of anyone else, including their respective firms or any of its lawyers, associates, or clients.
Welcome to Supercharged Supply Chain, a podcast that delves into the complex, complicated, and ever-changing world of getting product from a source to a destination with your hosts, Ron Leibman and Joseph Paris.
Welcome to Supercharged Supply Chain. I'm Ron Leibman. With me is my co-host Joe Paris, and we're here today to hopefully give you some information you might find interesting, useful out of our 80 plus years combined. Yes, we're old, of supply chain experience. Today, we're going to talk about VUCA, which is, in a world full of anagrams, it is one of the ones people talk about in our field for like the past, I'd say, 6 to 8 years. Joe is a true expert in this subject, so I give you to Joe.
Thanks, Ron. This is the third of a hopeful infinite series of podcasts, and we hope our audience gains value with each and every episode. So, as Ron had mentioned, today's episode is about VUCA, VUCA world, where VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And as we've seen, over the course of the last actually couple of decades, disruptions to the supply chain often are coming from unplanned events. Okay, we think about the global economic meltdown of the 2007-2009 time frame and how that upset the apple cart. We think about Fukushima and the tidal wave there, how it disrupted the chip supply chain, the microchip supply chain, and now we have COVID-19. It just seems like a never-ending series of disruptions that threaten our supply chains and the way we, in fact, do business.
I agree. And it's not things that we really plan for. You can plan for a disaster, but it seems the scope of the disaster could throw off your plan because it'll be larger, geographically different, or as Joe said, in terms of COVID, 185 countries. So, how do you deal with that? And that is why VUCA planning, for lack of a better term, makes sense. You try to take each component of your supply chain and you do a what if. And if you take that combination of what ifs, put it together, you can, as best possible with the knowledge you have at that time, find resiliency and in all hope be able to ride out the storms, pardon the pun, if they come.
Yeah, I think one of the keys here, Ron, is going to be to mitigate your risks. I mean, it takes an awful lot of, imagination to try to consider every possible risk to your supply chain or to your logistics network. So I think one of the things that we really have to consider as professionals in the supply chain is redundancy. I mean, if all of a sudden we're cut off, the company is cut off from its supply chain in Asia, does it have a backup plan? How fast can we get that backup plan up and operational? We've seen, especially with COVID, that edicts are coming out from various governments from around the world, almost instantaneously enacted, and that leaves very, very little room to maneuver. I was just reading today where some meats coming into China from Australia and New Zealand tested positive for COVID. So, how do we now, how will the Chinese now react to that discovery? And what will Australia and New Zealand do as countermeasures to it? And this is just a rolling battle where, the opportunity to analyze and initiate and implement a long-term fix is just not possible. It just doesn't exist. So that means that we have to take iterative steps as circumstances present themselves.
And I think without a lot of help from the government in a way, because some of these things, perhaps like the food issues that Joe just detailed, we have food laws, but we really don't have food laws relating to this kind of pathogen and how to deal with it. And one of the things that is certain is the law runs behind the innovation in the supply chain. So to some degree, we're out there. There's also the question of one of the things that always has to be looked at when you're doing this kind of planning is insurance. And how do you insure and what do you insure for? Well, sometimes you're going to write some form of manuscript policy for something that doesn't exist anymore. Because, let's face it, the backstop for disaster is insurance if you can find it. And I think the current, pushing and shoving in the court system over what is covered just in terms of, out of stocks and shutdowns because of the pandemic shows how, while we kind of knew acts of God existed, we never moved forward to have an expectation of what's happened now. So I think that's a key thing that we don't always take into account. We just let our insurance people do it. But as we plan, we should say, okay, I'm doing the best I can. If everything screws up, how do I recoup? Can I recoup? Because that could change your planning entirely in terms of how many backups you have. Do I have 5 warehouses in 5 countries? Or am I okay just insourcing some stuff to California?
Right. It's great that you bring up insurance, because most insurances are designed for one-off events. You think about the tidal wave that took out Fukushima and disrupted the microchip supply chain, for instance. That was able to be, that was an isolated event. You know what I mean? Geographically, it was isolated. So bringing up a redundant supply chain someplace else is not as difficult. And it was also isolated in the amount of time it took. Now, here we are, 8 months, 9 months into a global pandemic, okay? This is not an isolated incident that can be cellularized and contained. This is something that is, pervasive throughout the entirety of the supply chain, and the velocity in which these changes are taking place are forcing companies to react in real time and not giving them the opportunity to, perform the due diligence and analysis they once had the luxury of doing.
So Joe, in your practice currently, is there kind of an example for these folks? Because what we're saying, seems to be what you read in the press and stuff. Maybe you can give them something a little bit concrete.
Well, relationships cost money, okay? And there's a tendency for companies to want to sole source their product from one vendor, okay, even in one geography. And what I'm seeing is that companies are now recognizing the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket and developing redundancy, not just redundancy within a geography, but redundancy in separate geographies. Now, this is going to add cost to relationships, okay? Because no longer do you have to maintain and audit one vendor, you have to maintain and audit multiple vendors. But I think this is a reasonable risk that needs to be taken, rather than having a complete disruption and resultant shutdown of not being able to get the materials you need in order to produce the products that you make.
Okay, I'm going to hit you with one from out of nowhere. And how do you think in the manufacturing world 3D printing fits into this?
Well, 3D printing, the velocity of production in 3D printing is not up to the speed of regular production. So for instance, if you're making a simple bracket, you could punch out a bunch of brackets really, really quick. 3D printing, it takes a lot of time in order to make those same number of brackets. So, technology-wise, even though 3D printing might be able to do as much, even better, perhaps, than traditional manufacturing, if you need a lot of parts very quickly, it's not, the solution is not mature enough yet, in my opinion. What I would say, though, is that instead of far shoring, getting everything from the Asia or the Pacific Rim or even South America or wherever, nearshoring. Our friends down in Mexico, we could get a truck of goods, from Monterrey, Mexico to the U.S. border and across the U.S. border in a day. That same container of product is going to take a month on the high seas coming from wherever it might be or more. So I think that, a good plan B is to develop relationships with our friends north and south, and make sure that you invest enough in that relationship for it to be worth their while to have a relationship with you as their customer. But the 3D printing, I think it's great for prototypes. It's great for small batches, small runs, but it's not up to you're not going to fill a container with 3D printed parts yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been talking to some people about 3D printing, and they believe it is the future at some point, and I think they may be right. I think that it obviously, like any technology nowadays, is getting a lot of hype as a solution, and I think maybe it's part of the solution. I don't think it's a bad thing to be tied into a domestic 3D company if in fact you are missing orders and you just can make them as fast as you can. But I wouldn't make it primary. I'm finding a lot, in addition to the nearshoring to Mexico, a lot of forward inventory now. Even domestically, people just putting. And as a matter of fact, I'm working on a project now in a perishables industry to set up a network in the United States and Canada of perishable warehouses and through a significant transportation company just for that source, to forward source for growers and manufacturers of perishables, not for the ultimate consumer, because the pressure that they're getting from their ultimate customer, that they just can't suddenly ramp up production at a moment's notice and do it, cost effectively. So they would rather be pulling out of a closer stock, and it would take the time out of it.
Right. So, I think that at the end of the day, if you're going to survive in a VUCA world, if you think about volatility, things move very, very quickly. They're not set in stone anymore. They're not reliable. If we think about, uncertainty, we're a tariff away from having our supply chains disrupted, and that tariff, could come from anywhere. And as you know, it's hard to make a 30-year plan when you don't know whether or not you're going to be able to import or export, your goods that you're either buying or selling. You think about complexity, all right? No longer is our supplier, are we dependent on one supplier? We're also dependent on the supplier's supplier, and the interweaving of their supply chains and how they affect us, and the ambiguity. Things aren't settled. I mean, you think even about the insurance example as you brought up. Insurances are for accidents, are for one-offs. Even if it's a force majeure, a hurricane comes out and wipes out your supplier. That hurricane is not worldwide, so it didn't wipe out every supplier everywhere simultaneously. So this ambiguity and how does the contracts that we write or that are written take into consideration every possibility? They quite simply can't. So challenging times there on living in a VUCA world.
Well, it is. I think there may be an example, certainly in the United States, that we see, and excuse me, it's watched worldwide, is this whole pandemic and the current Pfizer drug they're talking about, and maybe a couple of others. The question is, how are they going to distribute this? In what way? And the current administration talked about utilizing the military, which, by the way, I think myself is a really good way. But not a political statement. We must remember, logistics comes from the Army. That's where it begat, and that's where they do it on the most massive scale. But the current administration seems to feel that distribution through the armed forces is not the correct way of doing it. It's coming up with their own plan. So even when you look at a situation that people want immediately, the complexity of the supply chain is being argued by two different administrations in two different ways, which just shows you there isn't one way to skin a cat, but you have to at least start somewhere.
Yeah, well, and also consider the United States is not the final say in this. If those vaccines are being made in Germany, Germany and the EU might have a say in how much they actually let outside of Germany and the EU. So it's nothing is settled until it's settled, and I think that I would have a bit of caution in relying upon supply chains that are easily influenced or even disrupted by the whims of a government, wherever it might be.
I agree, and that's why there is the anagram VUCA. Because people wanted to have an easy way of remembering this. So in your daily life, as you're doing your planning, year-end, quarterly, or anything else, you could tell the people you work with, I'm in a VUCA world, and I'm trying to master a whole set of different inputs to give us the best output. I have a really complex job, and the fact of the matter is, unlike what people thought for many decades, we as logisticians have very complex jobs.
Indeed. And they're getting more and more complex every day.
I agree. So, Joe, I think that's it for today.
I think so. It was a great conversation, Ron. And I look forward to having our next one. And I believe our next one, if I'm not mistaken, is on resiliency.
I believe so.
Excellent. So stay tuned, everybody. Thanks for joining us. You've been listening to Supercharged Supply Chain.
Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to another edition of Supercharged Supply Chain with your hosts, Ron Leibman and Joseph Paris.
This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not offered as legal or professional advice regarding any particular matter. No person should act on the basis of this presentation without seeking appropriate professional advice. The speaker's views expressed in this program may not be reflective of those of anyone else, including their respective firms or any of its lawyers, associates, or clients.